They say you should never con a con man, but what happens when the scammer targets the wrong man, the kind who doesn't forgive, the kind whose name alone sends a chill down the streets? One bad decision turns a petty criminal into a pawn in a deadly game. But when he falls for the enemy's daughter, he's forced to make an impossible choice: love or survival. Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. A tale of jealousy, greed, and calculated violence. This case will leave you wondering, what lengths will someone go to when their perfect life is on the line? And how could someone so close, someone you trust, become capable of such unspeakable acts? Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of a deal with the devil. Nate Callahan had spent years perfecting his craft. A con artist with a natural charm, he thrived on deception, slipping through life unnoticed, leaving a trail of empty wallets and broken promises behind him. He wasn't a big-time player, just a man who knew how to work a room, spot an easy mark, and disappear before the damage was done. It was a game of patience and precision, and he played it well until the night he chose the wrong target. The scheme was simple, a high-stakes poker game in the back room of an exclusive club, a place where money moved fast and egos ran high. Nate had done his research, studied the players, and walked in with confidence. The man sitting across from him was exactly the type he looked for, dressed in a sleek suit, flashing expensive jewelry, the kind who threw money around like it was nothing, the kind who believed they were untouchable. Nate made sure the drinks kept flowing, the stakes kept rising, and with a few well-placed bluffs, he cleaned the man out. What Nate didn't realize was that he hadn't just conned a wealthy businessman. The man he had just swindled was Vinny Marino, the underboss of the Morello crime family. A man whose name carried weight in every dark corner of the city. A man who had left a trail of bodies in his wake, and Nate had just made an enemy out of him. The moment he stepped outside the club, he knew something was wrong. A chill crept down his spine as he spotted the black SUV idling near the curb, headlights glaring through the night. He picked up his pace, trying to shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him, but the sound of footsteps closing in behind him sent a wave of panic through his chest. Before he could react, strong hands grabbed him, shoving him into the vehicle. The doors slammed shut, the streetlights disappearing behind tinted windows, and Nate knew this wasn't just a warning. The drive was silent, except for the heavy breathing in the darkness. The men flanking him didn't speak, their presence alone a reminder that he had made a mistake he couldn't afford. The car weaved through the city, leaving behind the familiar neon glow of downtown, heading into the unknown. Every second stretched into an eternity, his mind racing through possible escape routes, but there was no way out. He was trapped. The SUV finally rolled to a stop in front of a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town. A place forgotten by the world where screams would go unheard. The men dragged him out, leading him through a set of heavy metal doors, the scent of oil and dust thick in the air. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the concrete floor. And then he saw him, Vinny Marino, standing at the center of it all, calm, collected, dangerous. Nate had seen fear before, but he had never felt it like this. Vinny didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to make threats. His reputation did all the talking. The realization hit Nate like a freight train. He wasn't walking out of this room alive. His life had been reduced to a single moment, a single decision. He could beg for mercy, but men like Vinny didn't believe in mercy. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of a bullet, Vinny made him an offer. A chance to live, but at a cost. The Morellos had been locked in a bitter war with the Del Vecchio family for years, each side waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Vinny needed someone on the inside, someone with Nate's skills. If Nate agreed to infiltrate the Del Vecchios, earn their trust, and destroy them from within, he would be spared. The weight of the deal crushed him. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. If he refused, he'd die right here, his body dumped in a forgotten alley, another nameless victim of the underworld. If he accepted, he was signing his soul away, stepping into a world where betrayal meant death. The decision was made before he even spoke. His fate was no longer in his hands. Nate had always been good at reinventing himself. It was how he survived becoming whoever people wanted him to be, slipping into new identities like second skins. But this time it was different. This time one mistake wouldn't just land him in jail or force him to skip town. It would get him killed. Vinny's men handled everything, erasing Nate Callahan from existence and replacing him with Nick Santoro, a small-time grifter with a reputation for making money in ways that couldn't be traced. A few well-placed rumors, a string of fabricated debts, and soon the Del Vecchio family took notice. Dominic Del Vecchio, the patriarch of the organization, prided himself on spotting talent, on knowing who could be useful. When word spread that Nick Santoro was looking for a way into something bigger, an invitation arrived. The meeting took place in the back of a dimly lit restaurant, a place where the air smelled like garlic and cigar smoke. Dominic sat at the head of the table, a man whose power came not from brute force but from the weight of his presence. He was careful, suspicious, the kind of man who had seen too many betrayals to trust easily. But Nate had done his homework, knew what buttons to press, what stories to spin. He played the part flawlessly, confident but not cocky, skilled but not overambitious. He spoke the language of the underworld, understood what men like Dominic wanted to hear. It took time, patience, and calculated moves, but the doors slowly opened. He started small, handling shipments, collecting debts, proving his worth in ways that required both brains and nerve. The Del Vecchios didn't make it easy. They tested him, watching for weaknesses, waiting for him to slip. But Nate had spent his whole life walking the tightrope between truth and lies. He knew how to pass every test. Trust came in fragments, piece by piece, until Dominic finally let him into the inner circle. It was a dangerous place to be. The closer he got, the harder it became to ignore the weight of the job he had agreed to do. Vinny was waiting for results, expecting him to find cracks in the foundation, places where the Del Vecchios were vulnerable. And if he failed, the Morellos would make sure he didn't walk away. The deeper he went, the more he saw. The Del Vecchios weren't just criminals, they were a family bound by more than blood. Loyalty ran through their veins, unshakable, unwavering. Dominic wasn't just a boss, he was a father, a leader who inspired devotion. The men who worked for him weren't just soldiers, they were brothers, willing to die for each other. It was a world built on rules that couldn't be broken. And then there was Isabella. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, sharp-witted, ambitious, and fearless in a way that set her apart from the men around her. She had grown up surrounded by power, but she carried herself like someone who wanted more than a life spent in shadows. She was smart enough to see through lies, careful enough to never let her guard down. Nate knew better than to get close, but he couldn't help himself. She was drawn to him, the way someone is drawn to something just out of reach. He told himself it was part of the act, part of the job, but it wasn't. Every moment with her blurred the lines between deception and truth. Every stolen glance, every shared silence made the walls he had built around himself feel weaker. She was a complication he couldn't afford, a risk that could destroy everything. And yet, he found himself pulled deeper, caught between duty and desire. Vinny's demands were getting louder, his patience wearing thin. The Del Vecchios trusted him now. It was time to deliver. But Nate wasn't sure he could do what he had promised, because the more he learned about the family he was supposed to betray, the more he realized one terrifying truth: he wasn't just playing a role anymore. He was in too deep. Nate had spent his life manipulating people, getting close just enough to take what he needed before slipping away unnoticed. But this time it was different. This time they had taken a life of its own, pulling him into a world where the stakes were far greater than anything he had ever faced. The Del Vecchios were supposed to be a means to an end, a target to dismantle piece by piece. But the longer he stayed, the harder it became to ignore the weight pressing down on him. Isabella was at the center of it all. She was nothing like the women he had known before, nothing like the people he had scammed, used, and left behind. She wasn't naive, wasn't someone who could be easily deceived. She had grown up in a world where trust was a rare commodity, where every alliance was built on shifting ground. And yet, despite everything, she let Nate in. Their connection started as a game, an act of curiosity, a challenge neither of them acknowledged. Isabella had seen men like him before, smooth talkers, charmers who thought they could navigate her world with empty words and reckless confidence. But Nate was different. He wasn't just looking for a way in, He was looking for something more, even if he didn't admit it. She saw the cracks beneath his facade, the hesitation behind his carefully chosen words. Nate told himself it was all part of the job. Getting close to Isabella meant getting closer to Dominic, gaining more trust, learning secrets he could feed back to Vinny. But with every stolen moment, every conversation that stretched into the early hours, he felt something shift. She spoke about the future in ways that didn't involve bloodshed, about dreams beyond the empire her father had built. She had spent her life trapped in a world where violence was inevitable, and yet she still hoped for something else. For the first time, Nate started to wonder if there was another way out. A different ending. A future where he wasn't caught between two ruthless families, where he wasn't living on borrowed time. He imagined disappearing with Isabella, leaving behind the weight of his choices, slipping into a new life where no one knew his name. But the fantasy was just that, a fantasy. Vinny wasn't a man who tolerated hesitation. The pressure was building, the walls closing in. He wanted results. He wanted weaknesses, vulnerabilities, something he could use to bring the Del Vecchios to their knees. Nate had given him breadcrumbs, just enough to keep him satisfied, but it wouldn't be enough for long. He was running out of time. The Morellos were ready to move, waiting for the moment to strike. But if Nate gave them what they needed, it wouldn't just be Dominic who fell, it would be Isabella too. She wasn't just an innocent bystander, she was part of the Del Vecchio name, tied to the family whether she wanted to be or not. If the Morellos took everything apart, she would be caught in the crossfire. Nate had spent his life looking out for himself. Survival had always been his priority. But for the first time, he wasn't the only person he was trying to save. The weight of his betrayal crushed him, suffocating in a way he hadn't anticipated. Every choice led to the same outcome: someone would lose, and no matter what he did, blood would be on his hands. There was no clean escape, no way to undo what had already been set in motion. The longer he waited, the worse it would get. Vinny wasn't going to wait forever, and Dominic's trust wouldn't last if he sensed even the slightest hesitation. Nate had always believed he could outsmart anyone, manipulate any situation to his advantage. But this time, he wasn't in control. The game had changed, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to win. The weight of the decision pressed down on Nate like an iron vice. Every move he made now had consequences, each step pushing him closer to an inevitable disaster. He had spent months weaving himself into the Del Vecchio family, earning their trust, embedding himself so deeply that even Dominic believed in him. But trust in this world was a fragile thing, and if either side sensed his hesitation, his life would be over before he had time to react. Vinny was growing impatient. The Morellos were ready to strike, waiting for Nate to hand them the final pieces they needed to dismantle Dominic's empire. But Nate kept delaying, making excuses, dragging his feet in a way he never had before. He told himself he needed more time to find the perfect weak spot, something that wouldn't just cause damage but would guarantee the Del Vecchios would never recover. That was what Vinny wanted: absolute destruction. But Nate wasn't sure he could do it anymore. The Del Vecchios had become more than a job, more than a target. Dominic treated him like family, trusting him with responsibilities that only his closest men handled. He had seen the inner workings of their world, the moments of loyalty, of brotherhood, of something more than just crime and violence. These men weren't just ruthless criminals, they were bound by something deeper. And Isabella was at the heart of it. Every moment with her pulled him further from the path he was supposed to follow. She wasn't blind to the reality of her family, but she also saw a different future. She wanted more than a life spent in shadows, more than blood-soaked loyalty and endless cycles of revenge. She spoke of leaving one day, of walking away from the weight of her last name. It was a dream Nate had never allowed himself to consider, but with her, it felt possible. The problem was that it wasn't possible, not anymore. He had made a deal with the devil, and there was no walking away from it. If he turned his back on Vinny, the Morellos wouldn't just let him go. They would come for him, for Isabella, for anyone connected to him. He had set this in motion, and now there was no stopping what was coming. Then, the moment he had been dreading arrived. A message from Vinny: no more delays. The Morellos were moving in 2 days. Nate had until then to give them the information they needed. Locations, schedules, vulnerabilities, anything that would guarantee a clean strike. If he failed, the Morelos would assume he had switched sides, and they would kill him for it. The walls were closing in. The Delvecchios trusted him, but if they suspected anything, they would deal with him the way they had dealt with traitors before. He had seen what happened to men who crossed Dominic. The betrayal wouldn't just cost him his life, it would be slow, brutal, a warning to anyone who ever thought about turning against them. Panic clawed at his chest, but there was no time for fear. He had two choices: deliver the Delvecchios to the Morelos or disappear before either side could get to him. But disappearing wasn't just about himself anymore. If he ran, Isabella had to come too, and convincing her to leave everything behind, to trust him enough to vanish into the unknown, would be nearly impossible. As the night stretched on, Nate stood at the edge of a war he had helped create. Every decision he had made had led to this. Every lie he had told had built a path that ended in blood. He had always been a survivor, always found a way to slip through the cracks before the walls caved in. But this time he wasn't sure if there was a way out. The clock was ticking, and with each passing hour, the inevitable drew closer. By the time the sun rose, Nate knew he had to make a choice. And no matter what he chose, someone was going to die. Nate had spent his life running, slipping through cracks, and leaving his problems behind before they could catch up to him. But this time there was nowhere left to run. The Morelos were expecting him to deliver the final blow to the Delvecchios, while Dominic and his men trusted him like one of their own. If either side found out the truth, he was as good as dead. The weight of every decision he had made was crushing him, but there was no time for hesitation. The deadline was here. The hours slipped away, and the Morelos were waiting. Nate knew he couldn't give them what they wanted. If he handed over the information, Dominic and his men would be slaughtered, and Isabella would be caught in the wreckage. But if he didn't act, Vinny would assume he had betrayed him. The Morelos didn't tolerate betrayal. In a desperate move, he sent out false information locations, routes, and vulnerabilities that would lead the Morelos into a trap instead of an easy victory. It was a gamble, a final act of defiance against the fate that had been laid out for him. But there was no guarantee it would work. If Vinny suspected a setup, there would be nowhere left for Nate to hide. The night of the attack arrived, and the city held its breath. The Morelos moved in, expecting to find Dominic's men unprepared, but instead, they walked into an ambush. The Delvecchios were ready, waiting in the shadows. Gunfire erupted, screams echoed through the streets, and in a matter of minutes, the war that had been brewing for months exploded into chaos. Nate was caught in the crossfire, the life he had built unraveling around him. He had sealed his fate the moment he chose a side, and now there was no undoing it. Dominic knew the truth. The way he looked at Nate told him everything he had figured out the betrayal. Even though Nate had saved them, the lie itself was enough to mark him as a traitor. There was no trial, no chance to explain. Dominic's men moved fast, grabbing him before he could slip away. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, he felt the cold grip of fear settle in. The Delvecchios didn't forgive, not even for acts of redemption. But before Dominic could give the order, Isabella stepped forward. The weight of her name, her bloodline, was the only thing that kept them from pulling the trigger. She pleaded for his life, her voice cutting through the chaos, forcing everyone to pause. For a moment, it seemed like it wouldn't be enough. But Dominic wasn't just a man of power, he was a father. And for his daughter, he did something he had never done before. He let a traitor live. Nate was given one chance: leave, disappear, and never return. It wasn't freedom. It was exile. The price for his life was never seeing Isabella again, never setting foot in a world he had become part of. He had betrayed the Morelos and been cast out by the Delvecchios. He was a man without a name, without a place to call home. As he walked away, the weight of everything he had lost settled over him. He had made his choice, but it hadn't saved him. It had only condemned him to a different kind of death, the kind where he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, haunted by the past he could never escape. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. There are many more dark and twisted tales waiting for you on Mystery Minds. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.